Hey, remember back when I made that one beginner's colonization guide? Yeah, well, it turns out that it wasn't a very good idea. And you guys also thought so, which is pretty fair enough. Looking back, I was really bad at making realistic guides since I didn't think anyone was going to watch them. 18 months and 44,000 views later, I think it's finally time to rectify that mistake. If you're excited to see guides like this one come back, then for sure subscribe. I'd like to remake all of my old poorly made guides, so there's definitely more to come. This is also the first video that I have broken down into segments, so check the description for a guide to which section is going to be useful for you. A fair disclaimer, there are features from DLCs that I'll be covering as well. Of course, you don't need them in order to follow this guide, but just keep that in mind if I discuss something that you can't find in your game. So, colonization, huh? Let's try to not repeat that last mistake, and we're gonna treat it more specifically rather than generally. If you're going to colonize, first of all you're going to need exploration or expansion. You'll only ever take exploration if you're trying to colonize the New World or you want to find your way to Asia. Without it, you can't explore Terra Incognita, so you can't move your ships into uncharted territories. If you don't need to explore anything but you have land to colonize like in East Africa or the general Indonesia and Philippines areas, you're much more likely to take expansion. Expansion ideas provide better colonization ability with a second colonist and other benefits. So you're going to use that to try and secure your borders and lock out the Europeans from expanding next to you. Of course, if you want to go into hardcore colonizing mode, then you can take both. Their combined policy might actually seem worth it to you, granting minus 50% uprising chance and an extra 20 settlers per year. Okay, so you've decided that you want to explore the world. That's great. To do that, all you need is an explorer, which are now recruitable after the first idea in exploration. You can then take your pick of ships and set out on your journeys. Without the El Dorado DLC, you'll be manually managing your ships as they sail through Terra Incognita. Just make sure they don't die at sea from too much attrition by bringing them home every now and then. Every time your ships move into a sea tile, there's a chance they'll also discover the coast too. With the El Dorado DLC, colonization is simplified. You can select either 3 lights or 3 heavy ships with an explorer and give them a mission to discover certain areas. They'll do this automatically, but only as far as your colonial range will allow. So now you've explored the oceans and coasts, but your journey has really just begun. Of course, you need to discover the interior as well. To do so, simply assign a conquistador to an army. Moving an army with a conquistador onto Terra Incognita will discover the province. So long as the land isn't owned by anyone, you can do this pretty much anywhere. If the land is owned but happens to be a non-reformed New World nation, then you can still simply walk through as well. With the El Dorado DLC, your armies can also hunt for the 7 cities of gold. Without spoiling too much of the event chains, you can discover the Fountain of Youth and other mythologically based wonders, giving you bonuses and adding province modifiers. The main point is of course to add a feature to automatically explore New World provinces. So you've discovered provinces and you are ready to colonize. What's next? Well, if you have the Cossacks DLC, you'll have to pick your native policy. Usually I go with the repression policy because you'll still have to garrison your colonies whether you pick up the trading policy or the repression policy. So the frequency doesn't actually matter that much. Especially in the early game, those extra yearly settlers can really mean a lot. I'll get into native assimilation in just a moment, but I actually don't find it often substantial enough to matter. Coexistence is nice if you want to be lazy with your troop management, but really has no other bonuses. Keep in mind you can change your policy later for the price of 1 stability, so if you end up getting the exploration and expansion combo policy, then you can swap to the trading native policy to remove all uprisings. Now that you've gone with your policy of choice, it's time to start colonizing. You can check which provinces are within your colonial range using the specified map mode. Clicking on a province with your range gives you the option of sending a colonist to it, which will start the colony once they arrive. If you have the Golden Century DLC, you have the option to expel minorities from provinces which aren't of your primary culture or state religion. You can move both that culture and religion to the province in the New World, and it will replace the previous province with your own state religion and state culture. Once it does so, it also raises the development of that colony when it's done. Hey there, editing Quarbit here, just to add in the fact that you add development to the colony by actually removing the development from the original province. So, there's a pretty big debate around whether that's really worth it anymore, but just to let you know, that's what actually happens now. It doesn't just add development. Keep in mind that once a colonist is sent to expel minorities, they can't actually be recalled. So be sure to plan your strategy around that as well. Usually, colonies will cost you money each month. You can only have as many colonies as you have colonists before you have to pay more than 2 ducats for the next one. However, there is currently an exploit in 1.30.4 where you can make money by expelling minorities if you have the 6th exploration idea and the Exile Colonial Companies government reform. This is because the cost becomes negative 130%, so the game breaks and starts to give you money from expelling minorities. You can use that how you will. Anyway, once your colonist has arrived, it's all automatic from there. Your colony will grow over time in accordance to your settler growth. Your settler growth can be improved through diplotech, ideas, and policies mainly. It can also be decreased through climate modifiers like tropical or arctic, or if you're just starting out a colonial nation and you have no adjacent colonies. If you keep your colonists in a province, it also gets the benefit of settler chance. This is the monthly chance that 25 additional settlers will join the colony. It has a ton of driving factors behind it, but it's important to note that the chance will diminish as the colony gets closer to finishing. The math roughly checks out to around +3 colonists per year for every 1% settler chance you have. So stacking that can actually really improve your colonial growth. The religion and culture of a colony in a colonial region will change to yours, unless of course you have expelled minorities. But when it comes to trade company regions, they usually stay the original religion and culture unless the native population happens to be 0. As for the question mark you'll see here, that's the type of good that will be produced by the province once it's complete. You can hover over it to see the chance of each good being produced. The good will be revealed once you reach 400 colonists in a colony, and it'll generally depend on the geographic location of said colony. Next up is how the native population affects a colony. In most provinces, there is a population of natives already living there. You can decide to fight them, or they'll occasionally attack your colony. The aggressiveness of a native population determines how often they rise up. You can check by hovering over it. The ferocity determines how powerful they are by increments of 5% damage bonuses. You can sort of pretend this is the same thing as infantry combat ability for most purposes. So while native units don't have a tech group and they have very little morale and tactics, in the early game they can be quite formidable depending on where you're colonizing. The population itself actually does have a couple of effects. It determines the number of units that rise up whenever there is a native uprising, but also adds a bonus to goods produced once the colony is completed. This is referred to as native assimilation, and it is what the policy bonus actually refers to. It takes a population of 4,000 natives to make an assimilation bonus equivalent to 1 production development. So it's usually a good idea to keep them there instead of attacking them, but if it's really causing you too much trouble, it's not really the end of the world. Through various policies, you can also increase the assimilation bonus to roughly double, but take into consideration the idea that a colonial nation will probably be formed, so you usually don't see the full benefits of it anyway. Okay, so you've colonized your first 5 provinces. What happens now? Well, if your colonies are all within the same colonial region as outlined by this map mode, a colonial nation will form. Colonial nations are semi-autonomous subjects that don't take up any diplomatic relations. They can declare their own wars on natives or other colonial nations, develop their lands, colonize, raise armies, and so on. The only catch is that they have to pay you tariffs each month and are called into all of your wars. To be honest, tariffs are really underwhelming unless you invest more into the economy than it's really worth. You might get minimal money out of it, but there are a couple other bonuses for a colonial nation. For instance, a colonial nation with 10 or more provinces will provide 10 naval force limit, 5 land force limit, 5% global trade power, and an extra merchant to their overlord. Along with the El Dorado DLC, colonial nations that have gold provinces will occasionally ship over treasure fleets. Of course, that's only if your home trade node is downstream from theirs. There are lots of special interactions you can do with colonial nations, such as renaming them, but here are the more important things to note. A colonial nation is really poor at the beginning and usually can't afford to colonize. It's a good idea then to subsidize them at least 2 ducats per month at the beginning so that they can at least get going. You can also colonize further provinces in the same colonial region, which will then grant those provinces to the colonial nation once it's complete. Colonial nations also tend to like to colonize outside of their own region, which is extremely annoying and there's very little you can do to stop it. It's also important to note that you just have to have 5 core provinces in a colonial area to form a colonial nation. So if you conquer any of those 5 and you core them regularly, it also counts. This means for regions like Mexico and Peru, you can simply conquer 5 provinces and then core them and create a colonial nation. If there is one thing that you should absolutely never do, it's to state provinces in colonial regions, since you are going to lose the state and all that admin power you spent on it once it gets ceded to a colonial nation. Another thing to mention about colonial nations is that, while they can technically fight their own wars against other colonial nations, they are often maliciously compliant if you force them to, and are extremely timid beyond belief against native tags. They usually don't like to take more than a claim or 2 in peace deals, and they rarely start conflicts by themselves. Also keep in mind that the enemy colonial nation's overlord might try to force a white peace on your colonial nation, and if your colonial nation refuses, then you yourself are going to be dragged in, and the war will escalate into a conflict between the colonial powers. Another thing to note for players with the El Dorado DLC is the Treaty of Tordesillas. The first Catholic nation to form a colonial nation in a colonial region gets a stake in the whole thing by the Pope. A Catholic nation found breaking the treaty by colonizing in the same area will suffer lower opinions with the Papal States and a debuff to global settler growth for provinces in that region. And finally, independence wars can be fought by colonial nations against their overlords. Colonial nations act like regular subjects in this regard, but are able to ally each other and form an independence bloc against you. If they win the independence war, all colonial nations who participated on the victor's side will become independent. That pretty much covers the colonial regions, so let's talk about trade company regions and investments. Trade companies are available through the Wealth of Nations or Dharma DLCs. Colonization is nearly identical between colonial regions and trade company regions. Trade companies are actually manually established, unlike colonial nations, and instead of belonging to a tag, they actually belong to a trade node. They aren't exactly physical tags, and only really have a single subject interaction with the Common Sense DLC, which really just lets you increase their trade power by about 50%. Trade companies can also be established out of conquered land, not just colonized land, and are impossible to religiously convert once established. In reality, a trade company is just a group of provinces with modifiers on them. The important ones of which are 100% bonus to local trade power, negated penalties from negative tolerance of heathens and heretics, half autonomy effect on production efficiency, no religious unity contribution, and if the player has Dharma, the ability to upgrade centers of trade. They can be established in any trade node outside of the super region of your capital. This means that you can make a trade company node your home node as well. The really important part of trade companies is the ability to get an extra merchant if they own 51% or more of the provincial trade power in the node. Note that this doesn't mean you need to have 51% of the total trade power in the node, you simply have to have most of the provinces that have good trade modifiers. So your colonization strategy here is to obviously rush the provinces that have trade modifiers, then establish your trade company, use the merchant you get from it, and push all of the trade from that node forward. If you're going to be colonizing for trade companies, most of that is going to be done in West and South Africa and the East Indies. Now, we can't forget about trade company investments. They're probably some of the most useful features, especially in this current patch. They're available to people with the Dharma DLC. There are currently 10 types of investments possible. 5 of them have 2 tiers, and the other 5 are company-wide investments, which you can only build one of in a trade node. Note that it's not one of each, but it is simply one in total. There's not really a downside to building all of the tiered investments, but there are some which are definitely better than others. Now that I've explained both colonization and the trade companies, let's talk about strategy. Here's where we go from basic level to high level game strategy. Should you be colonizing colonial nations in the first place? Well, the easy answer would be to say, oh, I don't know, it's completely up to you, but in reality, it usually just isn't. You can fully annex a colonial power to get their colonial nations, and when a colony transfers owners, there isn't really a penalty at all for doing so. For some reason, the religious and cultural differences just don't affect anything. Please don't use it as a blanket statement, obviously. For instance, Japan has a major advantage in colonizing over stealing colonies from Europeans, because, the distance between Europe and Japan is extremely far, so it's much harder to full annex European powers. But let's say, for instance, you are a European colonial power like Portugal, England, France, Spain, etc. You're going to want to use your colonies as stepping stones and invasion sites for Asian trade. The amount of money that you can make from efficiently conquering and moving trade from Asia and Africa is far more than you'd get from colonizing in North America or South America for the same amount of time. There are a couple of exceptions, obviously. For instance, conquering Mexico and or Peru is usually worth the treasure fleets of gold you'll get from them for the early to mid-game. But when it comes to using your actual colonists and colonizing provinces, it's just better to go east and secure the trade routes for yourself than to waste a lot of time in the New World for minimal returns. It's also just a much faster economic snowball for your time investment due to the changes to autonomy on local production efficiency. As opposed to regular territories, trade companies only get a half reduction from autonomy on their production, and investments let them build up extra goods produced and even more production efficiency. When you compare that to the tariff income from colonial nations, there's just no contest. But just in case you somehow find yourself in a rare position where forming a colonial nation is in your better interest, then let's go over that strategy as well. Your main goal is to secure the trade. You want to make sure that what you're colonizing is either directly upstream or very slightly shifted upstream. You want to secure those trade centers and then afterwards colonize adjacent to those previous colonies to try to negate the -20 global settler penalty for not having that. It's also a pretty good idea to try and fabricate on natives to get claims next to your colonial nations, and then declare on them yourself. If you give your colony a claim, they're not really going to do anything with it. Colonies are typically very lazy and are likely to just let another colonial nation colonize around them. Keep in mind, coasts are also vital to blocking out other colonial nations, so it's much more in your interest to try and get as much coast as possible before you start settling inwards. Okay, so judging by how long this document is, I'm guessing that this is going to be twice as long as the first video, so I hope that this one is actually helpful and makes more sense. I mean, if you liked it, then be sure to leave a like. If you disliked it, then leave a dislike and a comment telling me why. For now, this is Quarbit signing off, hoping you did enjoy it, and as always, have a fantastic day. I'd like to take a moment to thank all of the wonderful patrons you see up on screen, starting with the General tier with Quiet Guy, Brennan Arsenault, Torvald, and Farron. Those in the Prince tier, Natsuki, Rockbox 2020, and TFLJ Martis. Those in the King tier, Chewy Shoot and Quarbite. In the Elector tier, Drunk Binary. And in the Conqueror of Worlds tier, The Watcher. Thank you guys so much for your pledges this month. It means a lot to me, and you're helping to move this channel forward much more than you know. Truly, I cannot thank you guys enough.